Right, so hello and welcome back to Books and Things, and welcome to another discussion video on my ongoing serialised Victorian-style read-along of Charles Dickens's amazing book Bleak House. So today I'm going to be talking about September's chapters of Bleak House, which were Chapter 17, Esther's narrative, Chapter 18, Ladies Dedlock, and Chapter 19, Moving On. So let's get straight into them. So let's start off with Chapter 17, Esther's narrative. There are kind of three phases of this chapter, three important things that happen. The first thing is that Richard is not getting on especially well with training to be a surgeon. He doesn't really like it, he's not working very hard, the people who employ him are aware that he's not working very hard, and he decides that perhaps he's made an ill-advised choice, and perhaps what he really wants to do with his life is go into the law. To which Mr. Jarndyce says, okay then, that's fine, we'll move you, we'll put you into a new profession and we'll see how you get on there. And Richard changes and goes to train at Kenton Carboys to be a lawyer. The next important scene within this chapter is where Esther talks to Mr. Jarndyce quite late at night when neither of them can sleep, and he tells her a little bit more about her background and about what he knows of her life and his involvement with her life and how he ended up becoming her guardian. He tells her that 9 years ago he received a letter from a woman living in seclusion who said that she had a child who she wanted to be brought up after her death in a very stern, sort of strict moral way, and asked Mr. Jarndyce to sort of take over the work that she had been doing. And Mr. Jarndyce agreed to take on this child, but not to bring her up in the manner that Esther's godmother previously had done. Then the final scene in this chapter, which is one of my favourites actually in Bleak House, because I think it's really quite sweet and nice and quite entertaining in terms of a presentation of Esther's character. We're told that Mr. Woodcourt, who Esther and Mr. Jarndyce and Ada have known in London, is going abroad to sail on ship and kind of try and make his fortune as a ship's surgeon. And before he goes, he leaves flowers with Caddy at Miss Flight's for Caddy to take to Esther, and when Esther sees Caddy with flowers she assumes that they're a gift from Caddy's fiance, and then Caddy points out that they're actually there for Esther. And Esther's assumption that they were very, very romantic flowers is quite entertaining considering they came from Mr. Woodcourt, and Esther is usually at pains to suggest that no one could possibly be romantically interested in her. One of my favourite scenes, and I like the illustration as well. It's a good illustration. So, points of interest in this chapter. I want to talk a little bit about Richard as a character and about Richard's kind of want of steadiness. Everything in Richard, apart from his kind of affection for people, seems to drop off really quite quickly. He comes very often to see them in London, but he doesn't write letters after a little while because he just falls out of the habit. Esther says that he has been educated in no habits of application and concentration. In trying to train to be a surgeon, he has no real interest in it. He gets bored really, really easily. He can't settle to it. But he's also so careless of his own kind of ambitions and future that he kind of goes on with it anyway, and it's only when Mrs. Badger talks to Esther and Ada and suggests that perhaps Richard's not that suited to it, and they say that to Richard, that Richard even confesses that he doesn't necessarily feel he is that suited to it, but he kind of doesn't really mind that much. When they ask him how he gets on, he says, "Oh, well enough. It's rather jog-trottety and humdrum, but it'll do as well as anything else." He says to Esther in his very good-humoured and careless way, "I have thought of that several times and have been quite angry with myself for meaning to be so much in earnest and somehow not exactly being so. I don't know how it is, I seem to want something or other to stand by." And when they press him further, he suggests that the law might be the thing for him. And of course we get the impression by now that the reason why Richard is thinking about the law is because he's thinking about his case in Chancery and how sort of being a lawyer might help him, or at least that he would be in some way close to that. I also want to talk quickly about the significance of names in this chapter, specifically of all of the various names that are given Esther. In just a few pages, Esther gets called my dear Mother Hubbard, my dear Mrs. Shipton, my dear Minerva, my Rosebud, and Little Woman. Now, I think the way that Esther and sort of names work is really, really interesting. Esther is given so many nicknames by Richard and Mr. Jarndyce and Ada. They constantly refer to her by various other names, and I think it's partly a kind of symbol of the fact that Esther has been born out of wedlock. The name she has is not a name she has a right to, it's been given to her, it's not a family name, and because she has been born out of wedlock within the Victorian society she lives in, she has no right to a name. And so the fact that she is so rarely actually addressed by her name and that so many people call her by other names is really, really significant and quite telling about her kind of social position. Like, it's a really clever way Dickens does kind of mini social criticism about the way that Esther feels she doesn't have a right to a name and the way that kind of society has taken away her right to have a name. You can see similar things, I think, as well with the character of Jo, who I'll talk about a bit later in this video. Jo is kind of denied a surname. and his first name is incredibly short. He only has sort of 2 letters, and that's like the whole of his identity. And again, kind of connections with the character of Mr. Nemo, who died earlier on in the book, who gave out the name to everyone he met of Nemo. No one. He kind of stripped himself back of a name and gave himself a word that meant no one. So the theme of kind of identity and names is really, really interesting in Bleak House. This is a really minor point. I have 1 sentence to say on it, but I really like the moment in this chapter where Esther says, I took out of my basket some ornamental work for our house, I mean Bleak House, that I was busy with at that time. It's a throwaway remark, but it makes it very, very clear how much Bleak House feels like Esther's home already, how that is our house, and she has sort of become one of the family and takes on this kind of ownership. Yes, sometimes she is kind of denied an identity and doesn't feel like she is the equal of the people around her, but she also is kind of one of the family, and she does have a home. Another thing I think it's worth discussing in this chapter is the role of kind of surrogate families in Bleak House, and to be honest, in all of Dickens. Dickens is a really, really interesting author for having a lot of books which end in marriage and look like they're going to go on to produce sort of very regimented Victorian nuclear families, but actually there's very, very, very few nuclear families in Dickens. I can only think of 2 families in the whole of Dickens with 2 living parents and their children all living together, and that's the Wilfers in Our Mutual Friend and the Cratchits in The Christmas Carol. I mean, there must be a couple of others, then I must have missed some. But there's very, very few, certainly very few of importance. And a lot of the central characters within Dickens' books often either only have 1 parent living or they have kind of surrogate families. They've made their own families. If we look at Mr. Jarndyce, Ada, Richard and Esther, they are a family in many ways. Ada and Richard and Mr. Jarndyce are obviously related in some way, but they're not that closely related. They're distant cousins of each other. They all have different surnames, and Esther is as much part of their family as they are family to each other. And they do form this really nice, like, little surrogate family in a way that I think is really, really interesting, especially because we know that Esther is considered her mother's disgrace, and that her godmother, who was her aunt, kind of didn't really consider herself belonging to Esther. She didn't really consider Esther her family. She said in her letter to Mr. Jarndyce that she was, if there were any ties of blood in such a case, the child's aunt. She was Esther's aunt, but because Esther was born out of wedlock, she didn't really consider herself to be Esther's aunt. Esther, who has no home with her biological family, finds a new family in Mr. Jarndyce and Ada and Richard. She talks in this chapter about Richard making a sister of her. But although they are a kind of surrogate family, Mr. Jarndyce clearly does not like being called father by Esther. When she says that she blesses the guardian who is a father to her, at that word, father, I saw his former trouble come into his face. He subdued it, as before, and it was gone in an instant. But it had been there, and had come so swiftly upon my words that I felt as if they had given him a shock. I really, really like Mr. Jarndyce as a character. I think he's very, very interesting and very, very Dickensian in both being incredibly eccentric but also very believable in many ways too. And I really like him and Esther's relationship. I think it's very, very interesting, especially the way it kind of changes and develops throughout the book. And there's a moment here that really, really moves me where Mr. Jarndyce is sort of telling Esther about how he came to be her guardian. And she talks about the shame that she felt as a child being told that her mother was her disgrace. She says, "One of my earliest remembrances, guardian, is of these words. Your mother, Esther, is your disgrace, and you were hers. The time will come, and soon enough, when you will understand this better, and will feel it too, as no one save a woman can." I had covered my face with my hands in repeating the words, but I took them away now with a better kind of shame, I hope, and told him that to him I owed the blessing that I had from my childhood to that hour never, never felt it. She owes the happiness of her life to his kindness, and I think that's a really interesting dynamic to set up between them of affection and also a kind of power because of the gratitude she feels she owes him. And finally, I do want to talk a little bit about that final scene with Mr. Woodcourt's flowers. I don't have very much to say about it apart from that it's a really, really nice scene and it makes me very happy. And also it's very interesting in terms of Esther's kind of unreliable narrative and the ways in which she attempts to block Mr. Woodcourt's admiration of her out the story while simultaneously actually drawing much more attention to it than she would if she were just telling it to us directly. Certainly, Esther does seem in some way to be quite taken with Mr. Woodcourt. We know that the night when her and Mr. Jarndyce have this long conversation when neither of them can sleep, that she is being kept up by something. She is wakeful and rather low-spirited. I don't know why. At least I don't think I know why. At least perhaps I do, but I don't think it matters. What is she worried about? Maybe it's about Richard and his career, or perhaps it's about Mr. Woodcourt and the fact that he is going away very soon and she is sad about it. And while not willing to accept that she herself might have an admirer, she's perfectly willing to suggest that Caddy might have one or even more, which is why she ends up admitting that these flowers clearly look like a romantic gift before she realises they are for her. "Why, Caddy, my dear," said I, "what beautiful flowers." She had such an exquisite little nosegay in her hands. "Indeed I think so, Esther," replied Caddy. "They are the loveliest I ever saw." "Prince, my dear?" said I in a whisper. "No," answered Caddy, shaking her head and holding them for me to smell. "Not Prince." "Well, to be sure, Caddy, you must have 2 lovers." "What? Do they look like that sort of thing?" said Caddy. "Do they look like that sort of thing?" I repeated, pinching her cheek. On which, of course, Caddy informs Esther that the flowers were in fact for her. I like that bit. Right, moving on to the next chapter, chapter 18, Lady Dedlock. So, in chapter 18, Lady Dedlock, we begin the chapter with Richard going in to learn about the law at Kenjan Carboys and perhaps not buckling down to it quite as well as he should and spending rather a lot more money than perhaps he should because he really doesn't understand money. In some ways I think Richard is more of a child about money than Mr. Skimpole, and perhaps more a genuine child because I think he genuinely doesn't quite understand how money works. Meanwhile, Mr. Jarndyce, Esther, Ada and Mr. Skimpole go up to see Mr. Boythorn where he lives near the Dedlocks, and while there they encounter the Dedlocks. In fact, they go to the local church, and when Lady Dedlock turns around and looks at Esther, Esther is struck by something in her that seems familiar in some way, and she thinks of all things of her godmother when she was growing up as a child. And later in their visit, Esther, Ada and Mr. Jarndyce meet Lady Dedlock. Lady Dedlock recognises Mr. Jarndyce, says that Mr. Jarndyce used to know her sister once a long time ago, and meets Ada and Esther. She remains as cold and as aloof as we have seen her so many times in the third person narrative, and when she calls for an attendant to come with the carriage to help her out of the rain that they are caught in, she finds that both her lady's maid and Rosa, we've met before, both turn up. Lady Dedlock meant Rosa, which her French lady's maid is not very impressed by and not very happy about at all, and at the end of the chapter walks very angrily across the grass without her shoes on, as you do. So, points of interest in this chapter. I won't dwell too much on Richard because I already spoke about him quite a lot in the last chapter, but I do think it's interesting to compare him and Skimpole's attitudes towards money, because there is something in common between them. I find Richard a much more likeable character than Mr. Skimpole, partly because Richard, though struggling to kind of make money for himself, in general only wastes his own money, not other people's, and yet Richard immediately began to spend all the money he had in buying the oddest little ornaments and luxuries for this lodging. And as often as Ada and I dissuaded him from making many purchases that he had in contemplation, which was particularly unnecessary and expensive, he took credit for what it would have cost him and made out that to spend anything less or something else was to save the difference. So Richard has a weird way of looking at money which makes him feel much better about the money he spends, as does Mr. Skimpole in believing that he is a child who doesn't understand money and saying that, well, it doesn't matter if he already ate the thing that he was going to pay for because he doesn't have the money to pay for it, so, ah well, what a shame. Isn't it a pity that Mr. Jarndyce is paying all of his debts for him, but he doesn't care at all. And Mr. Jarndyce just seems absolutely fine with the fact that he's paying all of Mr. Skimpole's debts. He doesn't really seem to mind very much, and I know he's very kind and likes to give money to people, but I feel like there are worthier causes in the world than Mr. Skimpole. That's a story for another time. I said to my landlord, "My good man, are you not aware that my excellent friend Jarndyce will have to pay for those things that you are sweeping off in the indelicate manner? Have you no consideration for his property?" Have you, Mr. Skimpole? No consideration for his property? No, you have not. But from a character who I don't like to a character who I do, Mr. Boythorn is another thoroughly Dickensian, very silly but very wonderfully enjoyable character. "By heaven," he said, after giving us a courteous greeting, "this is a most infamous coach. It is the most flagrant example of an abominable public vehicle that has ever encumbered the face of the earth. It is 25 minutes after its time this afternoon. The coachman ought to be put to death." He is joking, of course. Mr. Boythorn is always joking. It's very hard to tell when he's serious, but most of the time you can take it for granted that he's not, and he just likes to shout in a very blustery, happy way at everyone. I want to talk a bit about the moment in church where Esther first sees Lady Dedlock, because it is quite an interesting and significant moment. "Shall I ever forget the rapid beating of my heart occasioned by the look I met as I stood up? Shall I ever forget the manner in which those handsome, proud eyes seemed to spring out of their languor and to hold mine? It was only a moment before I cast mine down, realised again, if I may say so, on my book. But I knew the beautiful face quite well in that short space of time. And very strangely, there was something quickened within me, associated with the lonely days at my godmother's, yes, away even to those days when I had stood on tiptoe to dress myself at my little glass after dressing my doll. And this, although I had never seen this lady's face before in all my life, I was quite sure of it, absolutely certain. But why her face should be in a confused way like a broken glass to me in which I saw scraps of old remembrances, and why I should be so fluttered and troubled, for still I was, by having casually met her eyes, I could not think. The face of Lady Dedlock seems almost familiar to Esther, and this is especially significant because this is not the first time in this book that someone has found the face of Lady Dedlock very familiar. Earlier on, much earlier on in the book, when Mr. Guppy, having a tour of Chesney Wold, sees a portrait of Lady Dedlock, he says that he thinks he must have dreamt this woman's face. He knows it, somehow, even though he doesn't. The moment where they meet Lady Dedlock out in the rain is quite a compelling and impressive moment too, made almost spooky by the fact that Ada thinks Esther has spoken, but Esther hasn't spoken, and then they turn and realise there is someone else there. And Esther again feels that Lady Dedlock's voice is in some way familiar to her. And yet Esther is made quite uneasy by Lady Dedlock. Indeed, Lady Dedlock looked at me, and I looked at her, and I said I was indeed. All at once she turned from me with a hasty air, almost expressive of displeasure or dislike, and spoke to him over her shoulder again. The incident with Lady Dedlock's maid at the end of the chapter is quite interesting too, especially in the way that Lady Dedlock's maid and Lady Dedlock are kind of contrasted and compared in the way that both of them are exceptionally proud. The maid slipped off her shoes, left them on the ground, and walked deliberately in the same direction through the wettest of the wet grass. And we're also told by the keeper of the building in which they're sheltering that Hortense, the maid, has had notice to leave. She has been sent away, presumably in favour of Rosa. So I think that's everything I wanted to say about that chapter, and now let's move on to chapter 19, moving on. In this chapter we encounter two kinds of moving on. One is the general moving on of London, in which the term ends in Chancery Court and the season is over and people seem to leave London all at once for the long summer months. And then we also deal with the character of Joe, who is constantly being told to move on by the people around him, who is told that he is a vagrant and that he must go elsewhere even though he has nowhere to go. We encounter Mr. and Mrs. Snagsby at dinner with Mr. and Mrs. Chadband. While there, they are visited by a policeman who brings along Joe, and Joe has told the policeman that some of the money he has got came from Mr. Snagsby, which Mr. Snagsby says it did, but he also says that some of the other money he has got came from a veiled lady who told him to tell her about Mr. Nemo, and they don't really believe that quite so readily. And then Mr. Guppy also turns up towards the end of the chapter, and when he tells the assembled group that he is a clerk at Kenge and Carboys, Mrs. Chadband informs him that she has had some dealings with Kenge and Carboys before, and we learn that in fact she is the woman Rachel who was Esther's godmother's servant, who Esther knew growing up, which Mr. Guppy is interested to learn because he always wants to find out more about Esther. And the chapter ends with Joe being told once more that he must move on and move to a different part of London. So, points of interest in this chapter. One thing I think is interesting to discuss is just the weirdness of London and the fact that literally, like a lot of business in London and everything legal just shut down for 4 months in the summer. It does feel a bit ridiculous, doesn't it? We get this real sense in this chapter of the very stifling summer heat and how oppressive it is. It is the hottest long vacation known for many years. All the young clerks are madly in love and, according to their various degrees, pine for bliss with that beloved object at Margate, Ramsgate, or Gravesend. All the middle-aged clerks think their families too large, all the unowned dogs who stray into the inns of courts and pant about staircases and other dry places seeking water give short howls of aggravation. And we're introduced to Mr. and Mrs. Chadband as they take tea with Mr. and Mrs. Snagsby. Mr. Chadband is a religious man, although I think it's fair to say that his religion is a little bit ridiculed by Dickens and suggested to be a little bit hypocritical. It's certainly a very kind of moralising religion that is not of any use to people like Joe. It's a religion of prescription, not of kindness. I want to move on to talking a bit about Joe and his position in this chapter. Once more, Dickens takes the opportunity in this chapter to kind of put himself into the narrative voice, often when talking about Joe, or to be honest, when doing sort of any major social criticism that he wants to be very overt in, Dickens addresses the reader. But here he doesn't address the reader directly, he addresses Joe. Do you hear, Joe? It is nothing to you or to anyone else that the great lights of the parliamentary sky have failed for some few years in this business to set you the example of moving on. The one grand recipe remains for you, the profound philosophical prescription, the be-all and end-all of your strange existence upon earth. Move on. You are by no means to move off, Joe, for the great lights can't at all agree about that. Move on. The constable assumes that Joe must of course be an immoral sort of boy because he lives in Tom all Alone's, and Joe replies, "I can't go and live in no nicer place, sir. They wouldn't have nothing to say to me if I was to go to a nice innocent place for to live." And for a boy who claims repeatedly that he knows nothing, he makes a lot of very good points. People around Joe seem so willing to misunderstand him and so unable to see what might help him. Mrs. Chadband spouts religion at him, but it's all high and mighty and patronising, and none of it does him any good. Indeed, at this threatening stage of the discourse, Joe, who seems to have been gradually going out of his mind, smears his right arm over his face and gives a terrible yawn. It does Joe no good to be told that he is in a state of darkness, in a state of obscurity, in a state of sinfulness, because he doesn't know how to get out of it, and no one will help him out of it. They just tell him to move on and never where to. The final thing I want to mention in this chapter is Mrs. Chadband and learning that she is in fact Rachel, who Esther knew as a child. And she, like Esther's aunt, looks down quite strongly upon Esther because of her birth. Indeed, when Mr. Guppy, excited, cries, "Miss Summerson, ma'am," she says, "I call her Esther Summerson. There was no missing of the girl in my time. It was Esther. Esther do this and Esther do that, and she was made to do it." So I think that's all I have to say about those 3 chapters. In the month of October, we will be reading the next 3 chapters in Bleak House, which are Chapter 20, A New Lodger, Chapter 21, The Smallweed Family, and Chapter 22, Mr. Bucket. Oh, I'm so excited! That's a lot of new characters coming up in the next part. I had forgotten about the Smallweeds. I like the Smallweeds, they're very entertaining. I also really like Mr. Bucket, who is one of the first literary detectives ever, I believe, and a really interesting character. Let me know if you enjoyed August's chapters of Bleak House, and I'll be back very soon with another bookish video.